just an hour. Such a fruitful discussion.
That's good. Mr. Robb and Mr. Pugh, welcome. We're very glad to have you giving evidence. You are respectively Chief Executive and Head of Legal Services at Shelter, I understand. That actually Mr. Gummer was going to start.
So I suppose if I can ask a general question. Most people who appear in front of this committee and most people I knock on doors at weekends accept that there have to be cuts of some description in most budgets. With that in mind, how do you view the government's proposals on legal aid?
Thank you. I suppose just to start from our perspective, it's worth pointing from our perspective the civil legal aid budget has fallen year on year for the last nearly 7 or 8 years. So we're not in an area where there's been a growth in the amount of money that's spent, and in fact over the years the rights and support for legal aid in the areas that we work have been salami sliced. We would argue that, and it's not for our place to comment on other areas of law particularly, we can only really comment on the ones that we are. Certainly from our perspective, we don't believe that there is much scope for cutting further in housing because it's a hugely complicated area, and the type of support, legal support that many people need to avoid repossession, eviction, or to get decent repairs is very, very important. Clearly there are...
Stays in, doesn't it?
Sorry? Yes, we've just had some clarification. The evidence we gave to the committee, the original proposals of the government had been somewhat opaque or uncertain about what would and wouldn't stay in. And in fact, we met the Minister earlier today and he gave us some more clarification. So quite a lot of the housing stuff now would stay in, so we're very pleased about that. There are other areas clearly where maybe some work could be done, but we believe in housing there's hardly any room for further cuts.
But given the fact that I don't know if my experience is universal amongst colleagues, but certainly I think 2/3 of my constituency inquiries are about housing benefit. Will the introduction of universal credit and the simplification of the benefit system have a collateral effect on what you do?
We would hope so, and in fact we're very supportive of the universal credit when we see the detail of it. In principle, we're very supportive of that. But what we would also see, until we've seen the detail of it, what we'd first of all have to see how well that works and what's in the house, whether housing costs are within the universal credit or not. There's some discussion about that, whether or not that will be the case. And in effect, you wouldn't need to cut the legal aid bill in advance of that, because there should be a natural reduction in the number of cases, because many of the cases in that area are about clarification or administrative error due to the kind of the complexity of it. So what we would definitely argue is you'd have to wait to get through the transition of the universal credit before double checking that, if you see what I mean, because you would naturally have that. We're worried that in that transition period you'll get a lot of people wanting to challenge and understand what their legal rights are, and we would want to be in a position to be able to help.
That's a very important point.
I think if there is going to be substantial change in the benefit system, there is always going to be issues with that change. Even if the change is ultimately successful, there's going to be a transitional period where there's going to be uncertainty about how things are applied, and people are not going to be sure of their rights, and they are going to require advice. But in the longer term, if the universal credit does work, then the demand will drop off and it won't be necessary to cut the scope.
Yeah.
Perhaps I could ask you one final obvious question, which I'm sure I know the answer to, but it would be good to have it black and white. The government claims that, of course, there are lots of other organisations that can provide help and legal support to people free of legal aid. Maybe I could ask this. A, what do you judge the capacity now to deliver that? And B, what could be done to increase that capacity so at least the government's aims, if not reality, can be realised?
It's a very good question. I suppose just the first thing to say is that we don't give legal aid support to anyone who isn't liable to get legal aid support. So that, the only people that we give to, it's not funding a whole series of things that aren't currently in scope. We're under intense scrutiny from the Legal Services Commission and others to make sure that we provide only that which exists. We provide a wraparound service at Shelter that supports that legally aided work with other advice and support for ineligible clients and stuff and people like that. Genuinely, I'm quite fearful if the government was to go through with all of its proposals, the combination of the things taken out of scope, the introduction of a mandatory helpline, I think you'd see a massive reduction in small, localised providers. Shelter, we're a reasonably big organisation. We can maybe move things around, and we're very lucky, supported by public donations. We might be able to survive, but we wouldn't be able to give the size and scope of face-to-face frontline advice that we currently give. That would be the impact on us.
I think there's just a couple of points that I would add to that. Firstly, the consultation paper's own impact assessments say that something like 77% of the funding of the not-for-profit sector, and we're very much part of the not-for-profit sector, would go under these proposals. In addition to that, if the telephone gateway comes in, something like 80% of cases will be diverted to that, so there'll be very little left to us. And we believe that a substantial portion of our funding will go from that, and it will be very difficult for us to sustain the holistic services that we provide without the legal aid income that forms an important part of the funding of our services. The second point I would say is that as a solicitor, the shelter has a number of solicitors who provide advice to the public, and the advice that we give in terms of court representation we really can't do in any other way other than under legal aid. Without legal aid, then clients don't have cost protection. Conditional fee agreements are very difficult to come by in the sort of work that we do, and pro bono work, there's no cost protection for clients, so it's very difficult to advise people to take cases to court without legal aid because they're at risk of costs if they lose.
Now, I understand that 1 million people seek your help in one way or another.
They do.
In the course of a year, but of those, only 25,000 are people that you deal with under your legal aid contract.
Indeed.
So it represents a very small part of the total value of what you do for society.
Indeed, but it's a massively important one for a number of reasons. I should point out that the 1 million people come to us from everything just from very basic, sort of a little bit worried, and we have a website. The vast majority of those people are through our website, and we get hundreds of thousands of people a month come to our website for a bit of advice on a tenancy or work, a landlord or deposits and a whole range of stuff like that.
I send people to see you.
Indeed, most of your colleagues do, and we're grateful for them. But some of the most vulnerable clients that we work with are those that are most in danger of being evicted or repossessed or made homeless. Are supported by this core bit of work, which is the legally aided work. And that legally aided work allows us, because that's the most expensive part of what we do, and those people who need the most help are those that walk into a service and say, I'm just about to be made homeless, or I'm about to be thrown out, or my landlord is evicting me and I think it might be illegal. To work through the complexity of that case and the government support to do that is such a significant part, and we can build offices and support around that. But if you take that out, then our ability to do anything other than just face-to-face, anything other than telephone and web becomes much more difficult for us, and that's the issue. Those people need that. Some people absolutely need that sustained face-to-face legal advice. Many of the people that you may refer to us may end up getting legal aid because of the nature of their case, and we just wouldn't be able to help them in the same way without it.
Year on year, about 60% of the people that we see in our face-to-face advice services are funded by legal aid. We help a lot more through our website, through information and through our helpline, but face-to-face advice services, about 60% are legal aid funded.
And I wonder if I could just, to make another point, is that for many of those, if we can get it, the legal aid allows us to maybe stop that getting to court or stop that getting to the worst. A bit of early legal advice which says, you've actually got a very good case, we'll get in touch with your landlord, or we'll talk to the local authority or whatever, stops that getting to the point where it gets even worse. And actually, if we get to this point, we could see many more people ending up in court or being dispossessed, and the cost to the state will be far greater. So even though it's a relatively small number against the total number we help, they are the most vulnerable and have sometimes the most multiple needs.
But do you have areas of the country where you don't have a C contract?
Indeed.
But you continue to provide?
Not in all areas. In some areas we do. Generally speaking, certainly since the Legal Service Commission started about 4 or 5 years ago, there's been, as I'm sure you're aware, the contracting process has meant that. And in the recent round of contracting, we lost contracts in some areas and other people won them. So Shelter definitely tries to not leave any deserts. And the LSC has tried hard to make sure there are contracts in other areas. However, we are, and not just us, but a number of providers are now the sole providers in one area. So, for example, in Cornwall, in Kent, we're effectively the monopoly supplier of advice. And if we were to put, and the changes over the number of years have meant that other suppliers have just not been able to stay viable. And if we were then to be forced out of business in those areas, then you begin to create deserts, and that's one of our fears about these reforms.
Well, presumably there will be a smaller legal aid contract for the areas that are still in scope.
And also, sorry.
But the issue there is that a small legal aid contract is very unlikely to be viable. If only a very few matters are left per area per year, then it's very difficult to see how anybody could deliver that in any kind of sustainable way.
We already underwrite our Legal Services Commission with voluntary funding to make it viable in those areas where we work. We will put in donated income to underwrite the cost of the contracts.
That's really why I'm trying to establish what you do in those areas where you don't have an LSC contract.
It would depend.
Continuing to help.
Yes, it will depend on. We might not give that direct. We might not have an open service where you can just walk in. We might be providing some local authority funded work to do support work, or we might do things. But in terms of actually being able, there will be other providers in that area. We work very closely with Citizens Advice and other types of providers who may have won the contract in that area. And quite often we refer, certainly us in the Citizens Advice, if we're not operating in an area, we'll almost certainly refer to the Citizens Advice in that area. So we try to make sure that we're doing that.
Could I just ask one supplementary on that? I mean, you say that conditional fee arrangements agreements are difficult to find, but if I play devil's advocate, if you were to withdraw from the scene, would there be a growing business opportunity for those organisations that could provide them?
Not in the sort of cases that we deal with, no. I mean, a lot of the cases that we deal with aren't money related, and the ones that are, the disrepair claims and so on, the value of them is relatively small, and the difficulty of getting insurance to cover the cost risk is quite high, and the costs that would be required to fund that insurance are quite high. So we don't think that there is going to be a market that develops in the kind of work that we do.
I mean, most of our clients don't, if in effect, want to end up in court. You know, this is not a sort of, they're not seeking, they come to us as a measure of last resort, in effect, to save their home in one way or the other. So the disrepair cases are different, but generally speaking, our clients are quite desperate when they get to us in terms of seeking legal aid.
Okay, thank you.
That's correct.
Yeah, the Green Paper say that it's going to obviously keep legal aid for housing cases where somebody is at risk of becoming homeless. But you've said in your papers that you think that their definition of who is going to become homeless is very narrow. So I was going to ask if you can explain why you think that their definition is narrow, and perhaps give us an example of some cases where somebody may be facing homelessness but would not be eligible for legal aid under the proposed reform.
There's two aspects to that, I think. The first is that on the face of the consultation paper, in terms of homelessness advice, the government only refers to retaining in the county court appeal stage of homelessness advice. There was a parliamentary answer last week, and we've had a meeting with the Minister today at which it's been clarified that their intention is to retain in scope all homelessness, including the application and the review stage, and we're very grateful for that. But our evidence to the committee was on the basis of what's on the face of the paper, which is only that the county court appeal stage would stay in. But there are other areas where we think that people who are at risk of homelessness, even if not actually homeless, would no longer get advice under these provisions. An obvious example would be people who are suffering from illegal eviction. Again, the cause of action for that, which is breach of the Covenant for Quiet Enjoyment, is expressly stated as going out in the consultation paper. We're very keen to stress as well that a fundamental part of what we do is advice as well as court representation. We help people at the early stages. We help them resolve their housing benefit problems. We help them if they've got arrears problems and dealing with debts. We stop cases getting to court. So those people are at risk of homelessness, even if they're not at immediate risk of homelessness. And if we can't provide that early advice and that early intervention, which is legal advice, but isn't advice in court yet, if we can't provide that, then more cases will get through to the court stage. More people will be at immediate risk of homelessness. And in many cases, it'll be too late.
Can you give us some examples of where you think early intervention in housing problems could save funds in the longer term? And are you aware of any sort of hard evidence which backs this assertion that by intervening at early stages, public savings can be made?
In terms of hard evidence, the Citizens Advice produced a paper, I think, last year, which said that in housing and debt cases, for every pound the state spends on legal aid, it saves about £3, and it's about £9 on welfare benefits.
They've given us that advice.
Yes, I'm sure they have when they...
I wondered if you had a similar perspective.
We do, but we agree with the Citizens Advice on that particular one. But carry on.
Yeah, there are, I mean, in terms of examples, there are a number of examples. The one I just gave about resolving problems with housing benefit, for example, which enables arrears to be cleared without the case having to go to court. Negotiating with landlords, it happens relatively frequently that landlords want tenants out of the properties and they don't necessarily know what their obligations are, so they just tell them they have to leave. And obviously that's not the proper process. And if we get involved and we negotiate with the landlord at that stage and we say this is not the way it's supposed to happen, then we can prevent people being unlawfully evicted and having to go back to court to seek reinstatement to their property. There are a number of examples, I think.
And just to point out, on occasion, we also stop people going to court. In a sense, we can also advise people that people will come and say, well, I want to take my landlord to court, and we can advise them that they don't have a good case. So it's also not about always taking people to end up in court. We can stop people getting there as well. So it has on both sides of the coin, if you see what I mean.
Do you think there are any areas in the housing kind of case scenario that you think could quite properly be taken out of the scope system?
I said at the beginning, I'm afraid one of the sort of unfortunate things about housing is that it is an extraordinarily complicated part of the law. And I think
so is everything else.
Indeed, there are some that are slightly simpler, but not many. And housing has been reduced. The scope has been reduced, and we were genuinely having this discussion before we came here because we knew we would be asked this question in the inevitability of, you must accept bad things are going to happen. But on the housing front, I'm afraid I think that for us, the work that we do in supporting people in housing need in terms of legal aid, we think is as close as it gets to keeping people within rights. And for us as well, with the cumulative effects of everything else that's happening, all the reforms, there's very significant reforms from CLG on housing reform, on tenure, on dispersal of homelessness into the homeless people into the private rented sector, changes to housing benefit reform. All of those combined means that if you add in a significant change to the housing rights funded through legal aid, we would be really worried that we wouldn't be able to protect some of the most vulnerable people in this country. So we absolutely understand that the savings have to be made. We're happy to discuss those, but on housing in particular, I'm afraid, I think we feel even when pushed, there's very little that we think could be taken out. I mean, it's a tiny percent. It's less than 3% of the total legal aid budget. So it's not a huge area in terms of total amount of spend. I don't know if you want
much of it, of your the legal advice that you give at Shelter to people with housing issues is provided by professional lawyers?
We employ about 40 solicitors who give advice. We have solicitors in not all, but in most of our advice services around the country. We also employ advisors who are not necessarily, sometimes they are, but are not necessarily qualified lawyers. But that doesn't mean that the quality of the advice that they provide is any the worse for that.
But they're all
experts in,
and all paid for by.
Yes.
They're all paid for by the legal services. Our money funded through legal.
Looking at the large number of people who don't come under the legal services contract, and there must be quite a lot of those for whom you are giving advice which has a legal context to it. Who gives them the advice? Is that not all?
Well, what we will try to do, for example, on our website and our helpline, is we create crib sheets and advice sheets, and kind of which our legal team will support and advise. So you'll get what is effectively supported by the knowledge and expertise that they get on the ground from doing that. And part of Simon's job is to help our web team and our advisors and others to put in place advice which has a legal basis, but it's not the same as getting advice from a lawyer. So we try to use, so all the people that come to the website, we work very closely to ensure that that's right. But we wouldn't ever say that you'd had good legal advice.
And we do, through having advice services that are funded substantially by legal aid, and we do supplement that funding with our charitable income, and we can use that charitable income to give advice to people who aren't eligible for legal aid, and we do that.
I suppose it prompts the question, since I know a lot of people donate to Shelter, what is it that your charitable income gets mainly used for?
A variety of other things. It pays for some of our campaigning work, which many people support Shelter, and ultimately to campaign for better housing rights, better housing across the board. So we do a lot of work on that. A lot of our funding also goes to some support services. We have a children's Keys to the Future campaign, which we ran a number of years ago, which works substantially with young people, children and families around the country, which has been a massive contribution into helping them. So it's a variety of different things with that. But I think most of our donors accept that some of the money is used to in effect make sure that we're giving what people want from shelters, that we get the best possible advice and support, and in occasions we have to use some of our money to help to get that.
Sometimes it's information about where they
absolutely
go for alternative resolution of their
We have a helpline which is almost entirely funded, which is free to use helpline, which is almost entirely funded by voluntary funding. Certain specialist parts of it, government has supported on mortgage support or other support, but that helpline is effectively funded by donated income as well,
and open to anybody.
Yeah.
Yes, at the back of the Green Paper we have that chart, the box chart, with various pros and cons
yes.
into it. I'm sure you're very well familiar with it. One of the arguments that's inserted into one of those boxes is the ability of clients to claim to be able to represent themselves in many cases, or find alternative sources of support. I mean, what proportion of people who are in need of advice and representation on housing cases do you think that would cover?
I'll just say a broad point, but it's very hard to tell. The honest answer is, the number of people we help are the number of people that we are currently funded to do through the Legal Service Commission are the people who are due and are under current under the current legislation able to get legal aid. So that's the amount that we help. In terms of self-representation, Simon would definitely have something to say on that. Is that
many of the people that we help are very vulnerable for one reason or another. They have physical or mental health problems. They have difficulties with various other issues. The people that we help tend to be the most vulnerable in society, and it's very difficult to see that they would be able to help themselves and to represent themselves. The legal process, the court process, the tribunal process in the case of welfare benefits is extremely complex and difficult, and the law is complex and difficult and has become more so over the years. So it's very difficult to see that people could navigate that, and certainly in a way that enables them to present their case in the best possible way. So as Campbell says, it's very difficult to quantify what sort of numbers of people would be able to do that, but very few, I think, of the clients that we represent would be able to do that in a way that would achieve the same degree of success that we would be able to if we were representing them on their behalf. So yeah, I think that's.
And in terms of other advice, I suppose the question and the core of this is that what is legal and what isn't. There may or may, this is the crux of this matter, isn't it? In a sense that we would argue, yes, we can continue to give advice and support. That was part of our raison d'etre. We will continue. Our donations will continue to fund, and we will always have a website and a helpline, I think, that offers advice and support to people, no matter what income range they are, whatever their housing need. They will continue to get in touch with them, and we'll try and advise them. However, we believe absolutely and utterly that there is a role for the government to pay for legal aid to support some people, not just the most vulnerable, but whoever needs it the most, legal aid support to help them take some housing issues when their home is threatened, whether they're threatened of repossession or made homelessness or to be evicted, or their home is in such a state of disrepair that they have no other recourse to get it funded than through the law. And we believe that you should keep a substantial part of what already is in scope to allow organisations, not just Shelter, but others to do that. And that's, we believe that if you don't do that, then you will substantially be letting down some, particularly over the next coming years, some of the most vulnerable people in the communities at risk of really significant loss of their housing rights.
Because a person will come to you not as a legal case,
exactly.
It'll come to you as an individual.
And you need help.
And initially you may not know
that we don't.
The nature of the problem. And
they present with different problems. Yeah. They might present, quite often people come with a debt problem, but the problem isn't a debt problem, it's a housing problem, because and so and we have to, in our face-to-face work particularly, and sometimes people move from our help desk to our face-to-face and things like that, but you're absolutely right. It's what we try and do is sort out all of the problems of the individual. It's not just solving that. Stopping them being evicted would be the first part of our potential work with that client, which they may transfer from the legal aid thing. Just to give an example, it's not relevant, bit. We do a lot of, we're a court desk, and many of you will be aware, in the court desk, people will turn up about to be evicted or repossessed, and they'll have had no legal advice at all, and they'll turn up at the desk, and it'll be a shelter solicitor who's the duty clerk, and we will stop them, we'll argue against the thing, we'll stop the repossession order, and the judge will give them 8 weeks or 10 weeks to kind of, come back with a plan. We will then work with that person to get them a decent debt advice so they can talk to their lender and come up with something else. So that's legal advice leading into better
it sounds like you're making an argument for public funding rather than for legal aid funding.
Well, that's that's the question about what's legal and what isn't. In that sense, I think yes, there is a case for legal funding because I think there is a case very specifically in housing and some of the other areas where you need to take legal representation, where you need to go to the court to seek justice and for what's going on.
Our legal aid funding doesn't fund general advice, it doesn't fund help, it doesn't fund support. What it funds is specialist legal advice on complex legal problems. Yeah. And that's what we need the legal aid funding to do.
Right. So in other words, there'd be the client would come into the door, you do your assessment, work out whether it was an advice case or whether it was something more complex, and then, if it was a complex situation, then the legal aid funding would kick in.
Well, the first question we asked, the first series of questions we would ask any client, if they're coming through, are they eligible for legal aid? If they're not eligible for legal aid, then we have to work out another way through other shelter mechanisms, whether we can afford to support them, whether somebody else can support them in a local area if there's another provider.
Well, that's important. You apply the same criteria for legal aid as any practitioner would out there in the market.
Because we're subject to exactly the same contracts and exactly the same terms in those contracts as anybody else, and we're subject to exactly the same rules about the merit of cases and the scope of what can be funded, and that it must be a matter of law and it must be a legal problem and so on.
Yeah, some of the advice that we're talking about here, advice which ought to be given, and in my experience sometimes is given by local authorities. Somebody goes along and they go and complain to the local authority about the state of the property and the landlord, and the local authority is supposed to take appropriate action. In other cases, they might go to the local authority and say, you've got to house me because I've had this notice to quit. The local authority says, that notice to quit has no effect whatsoever. Well, if the landlord actually wants you to leave, he's going to have to get in front of the court and secure your eviction.
There's a degree to which that's true, but there is funding pressure on local authorities as well, and are they able to continue providing that service or providing that service to the same degree? And there is also the issue that in some, not all cases, but in some cases, what we are challenging is decisions of the local authority, and people cannot get independent legal advice from the local authority.
And our picture is a very mixed one of different local authorities taking different. And again, as Simon said, we would worry, and what we're hearing about some of the changes and cuts that are happening in local authorities, it's bound to have an impact on their capacity to support and advise. So there's a kind of double whammy going on as well.
In some cases, the advice has an interest behind it. They don't want to be obliged to rehouse someone tomorrow who hasn't gone through the legal process that are available.
And part of our challenge as an organisation as well is maintaining relationships with local authorities where we're constantly challenging them on some of these issues as well.
Well, thank you very much. We're very grateful to you for your help this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Interesting evidence you've given us, and for the written evidence.
And we should just apologise that we will update our evidence was based on the presumption in the Green Paper which suggested on housing, and we will send you an addendum to that to make it clear now that we've had that clarity as well.
For good reason.
Thank you very much
indeed.
Portcullis House, Line 3, the Thatcher Room.